to take functions and also pass them back and forth. So that not only do we have the ability to use a variable at different points in the code, we can actually use functions at different points in the code as well. This all boils down to the initial premise that functions should be as self-contained as possible. And so what does that mean is functions should make use of things that functions should make use of things that either it creates within its own scope or things that are explicitly passed into it. So let's take a look at kind of how we want to think about that. Okay, so a bit of a rhetorical question. I guess I gave away the answer already because I forgot to put it in side mode. Why are functions special in JS? The answer is they are not. They are just like any other data types that we've seen, objects, arrays, booleans, whatever, except they're functions. And so the reason why we make note that they're not different is because so far we've been able to pass objects, arrays, strings, numbers, booleans in from function to function and use it in different places. Well, we can actually do the same thing that we can actually do that same thing with functions too. We are able to store functions in an object, in a variable. We're able to store a function in a variable, and we're still able to pass that function, that variable, back and forth between different places in order for us to use it. So let's look at an example. Here I have my empty array. I have a string called happy string. Notice how on line 7 through 9 I push happy string into array 3 times. And just as a recap on Thursday's lecture on pass by reference versus pass by value, each time I am quote unquote moving happy string into amazing array, am I moving the reference or the value? Just shout it out, someone.
The value.
Okay, so we have two different answers. One of them is right, one of them is less right. The one that's more right is we pass the value, right? We pass the value of happy string. Why? Because what's happy string? Happy string is a string, and a string is a primitive, right? We can never change that string. So whenever we move that happy string anywhere, what we are passing in is we are actually passing in the value of happy string. And so yeah, so what JavaScript does is it looks at happy string, it says, oh, it's a primitive. Here, let me make a copy of that string, and let me put that copy of that string into the amazing array. And so now when I console log out amazing array, we forgot to print out the commas for you there, but essentially it prints out 3 instances of the happy string. Okay, hopefully this is pretty straightforward for us. The reason why we do that is because we say, well, what if we make a function in line 5 there called happy function? And in it, we console log out I am happy. Okay. One of the things that today's workshops, plural, will really drill into your head is this idea that just because you create a function doesn't mean you're running it right away. Okay. I could easily create a function that I run somewhere else in another scope, etc., etc. So the reason why that's important is because if I take a look at line 5, all I am doing is I'm creating a function and I'm calling it happy function. Okay, up until line 8, up through this entire page of code, I never run happy function because I never see happy function with an open and closed parentheses after it, except for line 5, and that's me creating the function. Okay, on line 9, 10, and 11, notice how I'm pushing the happy function variable into the array, and when I do, when I print it out, I see my array now holds 3 elements. Each element is a function. FYI, when you see the printout there on the top right corner of your screen, those brackets around functions, they don't mean that those are mini arrays. Those are just how JavaScript prints out functions. Okay, so each of them is one element, and each element is just a normal function. The inner brackets at least, don't mean anything to us in terms of making it seem like an array. Okay, so yep, so just like how we can push anything else into an array, we can push functions into an array as well. Now, one of the things that we talked about with accessing arrays is our handy for loop, right? It helps us go through and look at each element in the array. Well, if I'm telling you that functions are just like any other variables in JavaScript, if I say that we can store them in arrays just like any other variables in JavaScript, well, it also means that, hey, we can access it just like any other variables in JavaScript. So lines 10 and 10 and 11 should be pretty straightforward, right? Like we've seen them before in other contexts. We create a for loop. We start at I equals 0. We go through the entire length of the array, and after each iteration, we increase the index by 1 all the way until we reach the end of the array. On line 11, we say, well, let's just create a variable called element, and let's store it as the element that is at a certain position in amazing array. And on line 12, here's kind of like the highlight of this, right? Each element is in fact a reference to the element in the array. So if I want to invoke that function, well, that's the same as me just invoking element, right? And so on line 12, you see me say element, open and close parentheses. There's no function called element on the page, but element is equal to the amazing array index I, and the thing at that position, well, that's a function. So when we invoke element, it's the same as us invoking whatever that the value of that element is. And so now after we run through the for loop, we see us print out I am happy 3 times, because on line 8 we see our array has three things, and on line 10 through 13 we go through each element in that array and we run it. So each time we run it, we print out I am happy. Everyone good so far?
Yeah. I just have a question. What would be a use for for storing a function inside of an array and then calling each function all at once, or
Um,
after each iteration?
um, Calling it all at once is something that you probably won't see as often, but storing a function in an array is something you'll see very commonly. And actually, when you do the workshops today, it'll be all these kinds of problems, right? So you can kind of see what problems the workshop is trying to solve, and that'll give you some examples of when this will be useful.
Okay.
And by the way, like we're we're using an array as an example because arrays hopefully are something you're comfortable with. Normally, we're not passing in an array of functions. We're just passing functions directly. And you'll see that in the next couple slides too, right? So this is just more of a conceptual illustration. But if you remove the array part of it, passing functions back and forth is extremely common in JavaScript. Okay, so this is just something that we do as more of a housekeeping item here. If you notice, now we have a function called logStype, and now it takes in a value. So if we do, so here's a function that takes in a string value. Nothing on this page that hopefully is new to us. But if I move on to the next slide here, if you notice here now, right, if I'm telling you that functions are just variables, they're JavaScript values, just like everything else in JavaScript is. Now on line 14 there, when I call logStype, I can pass anything in, and therefore that anything could very well be a function. Notice how on line 10 through 12 I create happy function. On line 14 I pass in happy function. At no point other than when I created is there an open and close parentheses after happy function. So as far as this code is concerned, I never ever invoke happy function. I am passing in happy function as is. I am treating it as a plain variable. Okay. As far as I know, if I was if I was reading the code and let's say I was dumb and I skipped over lines 10 through 12, as far as I'm concerned, happy function could be a number, it could be a string, it could be anything I want it to be, right? Like there's nothing about that variable that tells you it's a function, except in this case we named it happy function. Okay, and so when I look at line 14, I invoke logs a type, right, which is going to take in a value and it's going to console.log and tell me what the type of that value is. But I never invoke happy function. So when that code runs, all I do is I get back the word function, because on line 7 it's going to console log out type of and then the value, and the value is happy function, so therefore the type of the value is a function. If we want to run happy function, well, lo and behold, we actually need to run it. So here we see on line 3 we have another function called calls a function. It takes in an argument called another function, and on line 4 there we actually invoke another function, right? Whatever function we pass in, we actually call it. We put an open and close parentheses after it. So now when I look at my happy function, and I pass that into calls a function. Up until line 10, no function is getting run. On line 11, we run calls a function. We pass in happy function as a variable as a value into calls a function. And then on line 4, we then invoke another function. Okay, another function is a variable. It points to happy function, and so when we invoke another function, we're essentially invoking happy function. And so we do that, and we get back I am happy. Everyone still with me so far? Okay.
Yeah.
This is a more common, like, yeah, so I guess to answer someone's question from earlier, this is a more common use case where, like, hey, rather than giving you an array of functions, we'll just give you another function, right? In an array, we're able to invoke it individually. Here, same idea, right? If I give you a value, if I give you a function, yeah, you can run it. That's the entire point. Okay, so for the rest of this page, we're going to go through a few examples before we do one last concept, I think. Okay, so here we have two functions here. Says hi, takes in a name, and console logs out hi name. Says bye, takes in a name, console out name. Notice how and this is for our reference, the name variable on line 1 is different than the name variable on line 5, right? Because a name on line 1 can only be accessed in between lines 1 through 3. The name on line 5 can only be accessed between lines 5 through 7, because this is where we go back to our handy scope designation, right? If I create it in the scope, if I create a variable in the scope of a function, I can only access it within the context or within the boundaries of that function scope. Okay, so I have two functions, nothing's being run. On line 9 through 11, I have a third function, and still nothing's being run, right? Except if I take a look at how this third function is being set up, it's called calls with name. Okay, that's the variable name. It takes in two things. It takes in a name parameter, I guess I should be more specific. It takes in a name parameter, and it takes in something called a callback parameter. And on line 10, very interesting enough, it invokes whatever callback is, and it passes in the name. So it invokes the second argument. So I give a function two things. It kind of assumes for me the second thing I give it will be a function, and it's going to invoke that function, and it's going to pass in the first thing I give it. So when I see us invoking this function now in line 13 finally, I pass in calls with name, and I pass in as a first argument the string Sadie, and for the second argument I pass in says hi. Once again, on line 13, I do not invoke says hi on line 13. I only pass it in, right, because there's no open and close parentheses after says hi. But if I go into the callback call with name function's body on line 10 there, I see, I invoke whatever the second argument is, I invoke the callback variable. Well, the callback variable points to says hi. So therefore, on line 10, I'm finally invoking says hi. And I pass in the first argument I give it, which is a name variable. The name variable points to Sadie. And so essentially, I am invoking says hi with Sadie as the argument. That then takes me back to line 1, 2, and 3. And on line 2 there, I console log out hi, comma, Sadie. Because Sadie is what I'm invoking it with. And the reason why we do this is now we see how flexible calls with name is, because now, guess what? I can call calls with name again. I can keep the same name. I can keep Sadie. But now I can just pass in says bye as the second function. And what that will do is that will now invoke says bye and pass in Sadie with a name. So in my output, I see hi Sadie, bye Sadie. Okay, it seems confusing, but really all we're doing is taking a function, passing it back and forth like we would an array or a number or anything else. Except now we have this added wrinkle of, well, hey, let's actually use the function, right? Let's actually use it, and let's actually call it with whatever it is that it expects to be called with. Okay, just as a note of caution here, on line 9, this calls with the name function. It's going to invoke whatever second argument you give it. So if you give it a second argument that's instead of Sadie and you pass in says hi as a second argument, if I just pass in a number or a boolean or a string or anything that's not a function, well, calls with name is going to try invoking that thing anyway, and it's going to throw an error. It'll say, oh, you gave me a string, and a string is not a function, or I can't invoke a string, or an error somewhere down that path, right? So the function is also kind of dumb, right? On line 9, the function is kind of dumb in the sense that, like, it will blindly try to invoke whatever it is that you give it, and No one really knows what that is, right? Like you could give it anything you want, right? It will try blindly invoking it. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, it's just going to break. Okay, so another example, very similar. Here now, instead of just console logs, we have we go back to our handy return function. Okay, on line 1, I create a function called add world, takes in a string and it just returns that string plus the string world. On line 5, I take in a function, and all I do is I call that function with, and I pass in hello as the argument, but I return whatever that returns. And on line 9, I create a result variable, and that stores calls with hello, and and we pass in the add world function. Okay, remember, and if you haven't seen this enough yet, this will become very painfully clear. Console logs are not the same as returns. Console logs are meant purely more or less for human consumption. It tells us what's going on. It doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't actually give back any value. The analogy I always give for console logs is like if your boss gives you a project to do, a console log is an update, if you will. It's like, hey boss, I'm working really hard. This is what I have so far. This is my progress. This is all these things, right? A console log is just an update. It's not the actual work itself. The return statement is the final report that you submit back to your boss. Like that's kind of what a computer counts, right? So the reason why I use that analogy is because your console log could be totally great, right? You could give your boss all the best updates in the world, like, hey, I'm doing this, this is great, I'm doing so well. But if you don't give it a return value, if you don't actually hand in the report to your boss, well, at the end of the day, your boss has nothing to use, right? They have nothing to look at. They have nothing to actually like use or do anything with. Same thing here. If your function doesn't have a return value, then you're not passing anything back and forth. Sometimes that's fine, right? In the previous example, all we care about was getting a console log out of it. More practically speaking, in the real world, your functions should always have a return value. Okay, so if we walk through this code on line 9, we invoke calls with hello and we pass in add world. That takes us to line 5, where the variable func, F-U-N-C, is now equal to the function add world. On line 6, we invoke func, so we invoke add world and we pass in the string hello. Okay, that takes us to line 1. Add world is now being invoked. The string variable is now the string hello. On line 2, we add hello with world, and so that becomes one string hello world, and we return that string. You always return your value to wherever you are being called. In this case, add world is being called on the right hand side of line 6. So we return hello world, right? We erase func in passing a hello. We replace that with the string hello world. And then line 6 says, oh, by the way, return that value back to where you were called. So where was calls was hello invoked? It was invoked on the right hand side of the equal sign on line 9. So we erase that side of the equation and we replace it with the string hello world. And then line 9 basically boils down to let result equal hello world. So we console log out result, we get back hello world. Okay. And then one more example. If we go back to what we saw earlier with the arrays, more often than not, you won't get an array of functions. You actually get an array of inputs to a function. So here, if I take a look at this setup here, this say to all function, it takes in something called names, and it takes something called say with name func. And all it's doing is on line 2 is it basically says I am iterating through the entirety of the names array, right? I'm looping through the entirety of whatever your first argument you give me is. And on line 3 is, and I'm actually invoking the second argument you give me, the say with name func. I'm invoking it, and I'm passing in as the single argument the element at every element in that array. So why would this be useful? On line 7, we have a group. It could be, we'll say a group of names. And on line 9, we have a say hello with name, and it takes in a name parameter, and all it does is the console logs out hello name. Now when I invoke say to all and I pass in group, the group variable from line 7 as the first argument, and the say hello with name as the second argument, all that's doing is if I go into the say to all function once again, on line 2, it says, hey, go through every single element in this group array. And for every element, invoke your second argument. So invoke say hello with name and pass in each element in that array. So we'll invoke say hello with name for Jane first, then Jill, then Pip, and then Mike. And so when I run that, I get back 4 strings of hello Jane, hello Jill, Pip, and Mike. And one of the reasons for why this is useful is because if I have, let's say this is a roll call and we have a class of 4 names, yeah, I could write out say hello with name Jane, say hello with name Jill, say hello with name Pip, right? And over and over and over again. But it's very repetitive, right? And I'm just doing the same thing over and over again. So in that case, it's actually a lot easier for me to just say, well, let me just create an array of everyone's names. So now if I have, if I have a class of 100 people, I don't have to write say hello with name 100 times. I still have to write it once, but I just keep adding the names to the array. And whenever I pass the array to the save all function, it will actually go through and say hello to each one of those names for me. So this is a very common pattern that you'll see, right? Is you have one function, but then you have an array of inputs, and the inputs are kind of what gets called with the functions. And last but not least, we're also able to pass in anonymous functions into the code as well. I know initially when you look at something like line 11, it may make you a bit uncomfortable. But I mean, if you also take a step back and look at it, it's just plain JavaScript, right? This is the exact same code as before, as the previous slide, except like we still have our group variable, except now the second variable is not a variable. It's just rather than saying, hey, let variable x equal this function, we're just passing in this function directly, right? Function takes in a name and it console logs out by plus the name. And so once we get into the say to all function on line 3 there, right? After we invoke say to all, names is still pointing to the group variable, and say with name function is now pointing to the function that we passed in initially into say to all. Okay, but this is just to show you that even though it looks strange, there's nothing that violates JavaScript, right? Say to all still takes 2 arguments. There's 1 comma, there's group, and then this function. The function is still appropriately closed off by the curly braces, and the say to all function is still closed off by the parentheses. So this is totally fine to pass in as well. And then just to kind of drill this into your head further, one more example. I have a plus function that takes in 2 numbers. I have a minus function that takes in 2 numbers. And now on line 9, I have a function that takes in 3 things. It takes in num1, takes in a function, and it takes in num2. And all it does is it invokes that function with the 2 numbers that are being passed in. So here on line 13, I call that calc function. I pass in 10, the function plus, and the number 20. And all it does is it invokes plus and passes in 10, 20. Similarly, I can pass in another 2 numbers, 50, the function minus, and the variable 10. Right? Same exact idea. Cool. Okay. The last thing we'll talk about before we get started on the workshops is this handy for each function. One of the things you'll notice earlier when we did the previous example with like the roll call and the people's names, like I said, it's a very common pattern in JavaScript. Common enough that actually JavaScript says, hey, let me just build that in for you, right? So for each is something that's, it's nice because, if you find it incredibly confusing, you could always opt not to use it and just write the for loop yourself. But we'll show it here because it also demonstrates a really kind of one of the more common ways that people use, callback functions in general. Okay, so what do I mean when I say callback? A function that's being passed into another function to be used, right? That thing that's being passed, that's called the callback, because the idea is that like, hey, like if I give it to you, you should be using it some way. Okay. Some built-in features use JavaScript, some built-in JavaScript features use callbacks, and so for each is one of the methods here. So I'm just going to the next slide and show you what it looks like with for each. Okay. Once again, let's say I have an array of things. In this case, I have an array of 3 bridges represented as string values. I have this function called log uppercase. It takes in a string And all it does is capitalizes that string and then prints it out. Now we do something that we've actually seen before as a pattern, right? Is we're on line 7, we're calling bridges.forEach. Okay, this is no different than when we call array.slice or array.reverse or array.push for that matter, right? For each is another array method. It is built into the array class of JavaScript, so you will always have access to this whenever you create an array. And all for each takes in is it takes in, if you look at it, a function. It takes in any function, right? On line 7, we're not invoking the function yet. We're just saying, hey, here's a function. Okay, so the bigger question now is, what does for each, what does that do with that function? Well, what for each is actually doing behind the scenes is, so what for each is actually doing behind the scenes is actually going through every element in that array, in the bridges array, and it is automatically invoking whatever function you give it, and it is passing in arguments into that function. Okay, and what does it pass in? It passes in 3 things. Okay, it will always pass in the element as the first argument. It will always pass in the index or the position as the second argument, and it will also pass in the entire array into your function as the third argument. Okay, so a few hard and fast rules here. Okay, one is it will always invoke this whatever function you give it on every single element in your array. If you say, well, what if I only wanted to invoke it on every other element in my array? The answer is, well, don't use for each, right? As the name indicates, for each is automatically going to go through and invoke that function for as many times as you have elements in the array. And it always goes from left to right. So you can't say, oh, I want to start backwards. Okay, for each only does it from left to right for every single element. If you need to change that, don't use for each. You write your own for loop. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, notice how on line 7, the function I'm passing, right? It expects 2 arguments. It expects string and index. On line 11, we don't see JavaScript passing in things into log with index. We don't see for each passing an argument into log with index, and that's by design, right? For each is also going to call whatever function you give it, and it's always going to pass in the same 3 arguments in the same exact order each time. And the elements that will pass in are going to be the element, the index, and the entire array for every single element in this bridges array. So that's why in the first loop, if you look at the printout, right, on line 8, all we're doing is we're printing out, hey, what's the first argument, and then is that index, and then the second argument, we'll say that in the printout we see that it says Brooklyn is at index 0, Golden Gate is index 1, London is at index 2. Okay, you cannot control the order in which for each passes in these arguments to you, right? You need to readjust your code to accommodate the fact that for each is always going to give you these functions in this order. Oh, sorry. One second. And then just to wrap up this function here. The other thing that you also need to know is, remember how I said it passes in 3 things to your functions? Well, if your function is designed to only take 2 arguments, that's fine, right? If a function is meant to take in 2 arguments and I give it 1,000 arguments, the function is going to look at me and say, well, that's nice. I'm just going to take the first 2 and use it, and I'm going to, throw away the other 98 or 998 things you gave me. So here on line 7, we see this takes in 2 arguments, string and index, and it makes use of them. On the previous slide, it just took in 1 argument and it made use of them, right? If you're planning to use for each, just know that your first argument has to be the element. Your second argument, if you choose to use it, has to be the index. And your third argument, if you choose to use it, has to be the array. Okay, those are not negotiable. For each is meant to be a shortcut, but every shortcut obviously also comes with limitations. And so these are the limitations for each, is that it has to run for every single element in the array. It only goes from left to right, and it will give you the element and the index, but it will only give it to you in a certain order. Okay, And sorry, yeah. So what was the question? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to finish that thought there.
No worries. I thought you were done. Um, my question is, I'm just trying to fully understand how the array gets passed in as an argument every single time you pass in an element. I don't fully understand how that works.
Yep. So the array is it's not explicitly passed in, but you know how when I call array.slice, I don't pass in the array, right? Here on line 11, when I call bridges.forEach, that's a way of me saying, hey, like let's like the array that we're talking about here is going to be bridges, right? And we're using the for each function that's attached to the bridges array, right? If I make an array called bridges, I do bridges.slice. I could
Mm-hmm.
pass nothing into the slice parameter, right? Or into the slice function, but I'm still using bridges as my array, right? Here on line 11, I'm calling bridges.forEach. I'm not passing in bridges explicitly as my array, but I'm still using bridges as my array.
Yeah, I get that. It's more just from a theoretical standpoint of fully understanding how um, you're passing in the index, the element, and basically the full array every single time. That to me is just
Yeah, I actually wonder if they'll make you maybe not, or maybe they will, and I'm just giving away the answer here. Anywho, there might be a workshop problem where they make you just build out your own array, but or your own for each function. But let's just like take a look at what's happening in my scene. Okay, so here I'll say David, and then here I'll say Tom, and then here I'll say Vicky. Okay, here an element of 3 names. Okay, and I have a function here that just says I'll call it greets. Okay, it takes in a name, and all it does is the console logs out hi, comma, name. Okay? Now, I could do something like this. Okay? I could do something like this. I could do for let I equal 0, I is less than x dot length. X is my array. Actually, I'm just call it ARR to make it easier for folks. AR dot length, semicolon, and then I plus plus. I go down here, and then I could do greets, pass in ARR index of I. Okay, and when I do this, nothing happens. Why did nothing happen? Did I misspell something? Greets array index of I.
you're putting array index I in brackets when you're putting it into greets and you need to do it
Oh,
correctly.
sorry. Good catch. Yeah, I meant to call it as a function. I bet. Okay, sorry. Yep. So I put this here, and I say hi, David. Hi, Tom. Hi, Vicky. Okay. This is so this is one way to do it, right? So now instead of doing it that way, the alternative is I can do something like arr.forEach, and I just pass in greets. Okay. What ARR is going to do for, or what for each is going to do for me is to say, okay, great. Which array am I using? I'm using ARR. Great. Let me make a for loop for you. Okay. Let me take whatever you pass in, and this will be what I invoke for you. And at every instance, I'm going to call your function, and I'm going to call it with these 3 arguments always. Okay. So just to prove this point, I run this. Once again, I get back, hi David, hi Tom, hi Vicky. If I comment this out and I run just this, it does the same exact thing. Okay, so these 3 lines here, they're identical. They do the same exact thing, but it's just a shortcut, right? It's a very common pattern that we see is, hey, I have an array of inputs and I want to do something to every one of these arrays, and that something involves calling a function. So for each, it says, give me a function, I'll just call it on your behalf for every single element in my array. Okay, and it also, the reason why we teach it here is also because it also makes really good use of a callback, right? Here, you give it a function, and that function is expected to be called. Okay, because of the shortcut, the limitations here are that we go only from left to right. It calls it for every single element in the array, right? It goes calls for every single element in the array, and whenever we call the function, we pass it in these 3 things in this exact order. The order can never change, so if I want to change it, I would need to change how I use it in the body of my function, not in the order of the arguments.
I have a question. So if you did wanted to use a similar functionality, but instead you wanted to go from uh, from the end, so from right to left, you will be able to create essentially your own function that, for example, line 7, it will start at I will equals the array that length minus 1. So it'll start at the end.
Yeah, I mean, we can do that a variety of ways, but the main thing there is like if you ever want to change any of these conditions here, you just can't use for each.
Right.
That's pretty
You would
much the crux of
you
this.
have to create your own.
Yep, yeah. So for each doesn't do anything for you that you can't already do yourself. Actually, nothing that we've used are things you can't create yourself. Like I said, it's meant to be a shortcut. It makes life hopefully a bit easier for you. Um, but if you don't like any of those conditions, or if you don't, or if those conditions don't work for you, if the rules of the shortcut don't work for you, then you just don't use the shortcut.
So when you're passing in the third element of the for each method, um, the array, it's just so that you can get the name of the array, or also to get the whole property that, I mean, the arguments that are contained within the array into, I guess, you like line 11, like, yeah, you're able to loop through it to get each element, and then you're able to get the index of those elements, and then you actually get to bring in the whole array that you're trying to loop through.
Yep. So all for each is saying is, look, every time I run this, every time I go through this array for you is, here's everything I know. Okay. For each, it will give you most likely more information than you need, but that as a programmer gives you more flexibility, right? If I go through every element in the array and I say, here's the element, here's the index, here's the entire array, um, basically that allows you to build a function that can almost do anything you want with that array, right? Because you have every piece of information that you would get otherwise. So for each is kind of almost erring on the side of being like of giving you too much data and having you filter out what you need and don't need. But it will always give it to you, and it will give it to you in this order.
Right. So like when you call for each, it's giving you the index in the array as an optional to use in the function that you're passing in. So if in the function that you're passing in, you actually need to make use of the index, you can, because it's being given to you. And if in the function you're passing in, you have another use for the array, then you have the array available to do whatever you need to do without having to, um, I guess, uh, explicitly pass the array yourself. You know,
Yep.
that's how I take it.
Yeah. And so here, let's just say what if I say like if I also want to know the index, and I also want to know like uh, all names. Okay. And I have a function that does this, and I say hi, you are number index. Sorry, don't mean to give people a number, but for now, let's make do. And then here's everyone, and I do all name. Okay, so this just tells me every time I run my loop, actually, and then I'll do my handy print out a bunch of asterisks so we know kind of where the break is between each thing. Every time for every name, here's all the data I have access to that for each gives me. And in fact, what if I say, hey, what if I want to take in this fourth thing? Well, let's call it fourth. Okay. Just to prove this out, and my fourth is, any guess on what fourth is going to be?
Undefined.
Yay. Right? So this is just saying for each is going to do all these things for you on your behalf. And this is kind of the terms of the contract, if you will, for using for each. If you want to use it, good. If you don't want to use it, don't. right? But this is what for each will do for you every single time. And so over time, as a programmer, you might find this to be a little. You might find yourself writing this a lot, and JavaScript says, well, here's an easier way for us to here's an easy way for you to do that, where all you need to do is give it a function and call for each, and for each will take care of the rest in terms of writing out the actual loops.
If anybody's still confused, what clicked for me personally was so when David wrote on line 11 through 13, I still didn't understand why array was having to be pushed for every single element, but then I had completely forgotten about what was happening in the function, that whatever was in greets on line 12 was what was going to get pushed into the function on line 3. And so these are all the optional arguments in for each, and it's what's going to be able to be put in, and if it's not relevant, then it's not going to be used. But if it is relevant, then it can't be used.
And because you're saying that the brackets, right now you only have the word greets in line 15 in the bracket, in the parentheses. So in the for function, it just it like forces it to just test if it's a function. The greets argument.
Great question. So it's kind of like the earlier example where we just blindly took a second argument and then invoked it. If you pass in something here, that's not a function. Actually, we can just do it, right? If I pass in something, for example, that's just like 65, and I invoke it, for each is not going to check it for you. It'll just try doing it. And if it doesn't work, it'll just tell you, hey, it's not a function.
Okay, so it's looking for a function.
Well, it's not looking for it. It's invoking it. And so whatever you give it has to be a function because it's going to try running it. And so here when I give it 65, it actually tried running 65 and said, yeah, that didn't work.
Okay.
I think this might be good for clarification. The for each only takes a function, right? It doesn't take anything else.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't know if there's any optional arguments.
Yeah, I'd take like kind of an operator, like for each I don't know, element plus plus, or like plus 2 or something. I don't know.
Let's check.
Instead of an actual detailed function.
Okay, yeah. So, I forgot about this. Okay. So, it just takes one function. That's it. And the optional argument is going to be the this context, which we're not going to talk about. But it doesn't impact. It doesn't impact. It doesn't impact us learning this. But yes, there's an optional second argument that. Yep, there's an optional second argument that sets the this context for the loop, but it doesn't matter to us. To answer, I guess, and I can't distinguish it by voices just yet, but you can never change this. Okay, it's always going to go up by 1. There's no like plus plus 2 or like minus minus or whatever it is. It's always going to be plus plus. It always goes from left to right, one element at a time.
No, right. I don't mean which ones it's going through, but say you have an array of numbers, say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you just want to add 2 to every single number. I don't think you need a function for that. I think you might be able to do that with just writing element plus 2 or something.
So you're saying if I have something called that num equals, let's say 1, 2, 3, okay? And you're saying I do num dot for each and then dot what?
For each, and I think it's like math dot sum 2 or something. I guess technically that's a function or something.
Oh yeah, if you do math dot sum and you do like something like kind of like actually what would the input be? No, this wouldn't work. This wouldn't work because you have nothing to call here, right? So if I like, what would you input as your argument? One of them could be 2, right? If you're adding like whatever element to 2.
Mm-hmm.
But what would you call this thing here?
Num I.
Num
open bracket I.
But there's no I variable. Unless they create a for.
I variable something that you were talking about in.
Well, so sorry. So this is what the function. This is what for each does for you. But they don't call this I. They can call this like I don't know what to call it, right? They just go through every element for you. So like it's not like they create this variable I for you, right? Like this could be called index, for example, right? And now if you use something like yeah, so now if I look at your code, then this no longer makes sense, right? I doesn't exist anymore. So it's not like they create a variable called I for you. The only time you have access to index is in your function is after they invoke your function, they'll give you something.
And you can capture the index as a second argument.
Right, but math.sum, like the only problem here, the bigger problem here is like, look, we've already called math.sum. Okay. Right before when we were doing arr for each and we call greets, greets. We never called greets yet, right? We say here's a function and for each calls on our behalf.
Mm-hmm.
Here we've already called math.sum, so this is going to give us back a number.
Yeah.
Right, and so it's going to give us like back, like, say 4. And so that's what we're doing now. Now we're saying, hey, for every single element in the num array, why don't you invoke 4? And that's going to break. Right? If I just do math.sum, yeah, this also doesn't work because math.sum expects something very different. Like math.sum is also a function, and that function also has its own thing, right? So if I look at, for example, math.sum, JavaScript, where's sum? I can't find math.sum. Maybe it doesn't even have a dot sum. Min, max, sign, tan, floor. Yeah, okay, I can't find it right now. I'm sure there's like a math.add function maybe somewhere. But like the point still stands that like math.add or math.sum, it doesn't follow this rule. Now, what we can do is we can say, hey, let's create our own function and let's call it custom sum. And it takes in, let's say, a num. And here what we can do is we can do like return or whatever, console.logout math.sum. And now we can say num, comma, 2. And so now we can pass in custom sum to here. And math.sum is not a function. This is annoying. Okay, JavaScript, math, add function. It's going to be called like math.add or something. Oh, yeah, math.add. Okay. So we do math.add num and 2. Math.add. Oh, okay. It's my guess is what's happening is if I just console.log out, actually, if I just return math, I wonder if this works. Oh, okay, great. So, and then if I do math.add, comma 2, this gets here. Okay, yeah. So the problem here is it's in REPL, they don't import the math class for you by default. But anywho, doesn't really matter for us. The point here is that I can't pass in a function, or I cannot pass into for each a function that I've already invoked, or at least for now, just kind of take that as a rule. You'll see later how, because we can also return functions from other functions, maybe we are able to do that down the road. But for now, just say like if I was to do like a math.add here, even if the math.add class was appropriately imported and we could use it, I still can't do something like this, right? Because this gives me back a number. In fact, anytime I call math.add, it's going to give me back a number, and I have to pass a function into the for each.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, and let me just share this with the class. And then, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I will yield the remaining time for the workshop.
No.
question about on slide 10, you use callback
Yep.
as a keyword, I think.
Yep. In this case, this is just a variable name. It means nothing.
It means nothing. Okay.
I can call this David, and this will work totally fine. Usually, you'll see people like it's kind of like when you name variables, you want them to be descriptive names. When you name parameters, you also want them to be descriptive. And so when people name a parameter as a callback, it just tells the reader, "Hey, I'm giving you a function, and you should use it." Pretty much.
Okay. And pass through these arguments.
Yep, exactly. I mean, passing through it is a little bit more like sometimes you don't know what that is, but like normally if I see like in the same way that actually if I go back to JavaScript and for each, if I look in the documentation, normally when you look at the default names that people give for these arguments, like here it says, hey, for each, the first you want to give it is a function called callback. That's just a good way of telling the reader, hey, I'm expecting a function as a second argument.
Okay.
Yeah.
Really quickly on slide 5.
Yep.
I'm wondering why does it return function instead of like why? I don't really understand that. Why is it like function comma function comma function?
Because I'm pushing in function each time, right?
So it doesn't push in the name of the function, it just pushes in function.
Oh, this is just the way JavaScript prints out functions. It doesn't print it out in this way. Like I said, ignore the brackets. This is just telling you, hey, your thing is a function.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't push out happy function comma happy function. It would just print out push out.
It never prints out the variable, right? So if I take a look at something like this, right? Let me blank out this for now really quick, right? Actually, this is a good example, right? So let's say let's say foo equal, I'll have a number 1, and then I'll have ARR, so a second argument. Here, if I do console.logout foo, it won't print out. Well, actually, it might print out. We'll see. Does it print it out? It does print it out. That's annoying. Okay. Well, I guess the point here is that I put in greets here. It might print out the name. Okay, yeah. So in this case, it does print out the function name greets, but like it's still like this is how JavaScript represents functions in printout form.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Cool. And then lastly on slide 13.
Yep.
I'm wondering where in this slide do we invoke a function to? Yeah, where do we invoke? Oh, right there. Oh, okay. Never mind. Okay, cool. Never mind. But then when do we invoke the say to all function? Oh, okay. I see. Then what's in the curly brackets like after that then?
I can't drag this down further. That's annoying. Okay, well, I'm just gonna copy this thing. I'll put in repo, and this is the same as us doing this thing here. And I'm gonna use indentation to help you figure out.
Oh, I see. So those are just the 3 different arguments.
Or 2 different arguments, but yeah.
2 different arguments. Yep. Okay. Cool. Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Yep.
Oh, I've also seen for each being used in this way that I just put in the chat. That's where I was getting confused. So you can technically use them with arrow functions then, right?
Yep. So arrow functions are just normal functions. There's nothing arrow functions can do that we cannot do with normal functions. So let me just rewrite this for you. So what you're saying to this person here, this is the same as us writing this dot for each dot function takes called fruit item And then we do console.log. I want to eat a fruit item. Yep. So these two are identical. You're just rewriting it on a single line. But this is still a function, by the way. Like, do not get it confused. This is still a function. And if I write it this way, they're the exact same.
Cool. Yeah, that's where I was getting confused. Thank you.
Yeah. So like I said, like I think honestly, like when you're first starting learning JavaScript, I think arrow functions take a lot away. It's almost like a for each loop. Like it abstracts a lot of it away. It makes a lot of assumptions on your behalf, and I think it makes it harder to understand sometimes. It's actually easier to kind of see the guts of like how it actually works, and then if you want to make it easy on yourself later on, like it's always like once you know how something works, it's always easier to use the shortcuts that are built on top of it, right? But if you just kind of like start using the shortcuts and you never drill down to how it works underneath it, if ever anything breaks, it just makes it a lot more confusing for you. All right, cool. It's yep. So I'm gonna wrap up this lecture. I think we've been going for almost an hour now.